Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Holder, Assistant Attorney General Ronald Weich wrote a letter to a member of Congress February 2011, a letter which was demonstrably false. Your department withdrew that letter 10 months later. When did you learn that that letter was false?
Well, I would not characterize the letter as false. I'd say it contained inaccuracies.
Well, Mr. Attorney General, it contained material, demonstrably false statements. Agreed?
I would say that it was inaccurate.
What consequences can we expect because of false statements made to Congress?
Well, as I said, there is an Inspector General investigation that is underway. I'll look at the results of that investigation, but I'll also be looking to see what happened with regard to the creation of that letter, if there's any more information that I can glean on my own before making determinations as to how people will be held accountable for the mistakes that they made.
Mr. Attorney General, it just seems to me that the policy is now going to be, let's get the least knowledgeable person that we can to write the letter. I found the exchange between you and Chairman Sensenbrenner to be interesting on mens rea. The defense is that Mr. Weich didn't know what he didn't know, so we're going to get the least knowledgeable person in the Department of Justice to write the letters to members of Congress. Is that what we can expect from now on?
No, what you could expect from this Department of Justice, as long as I'm the Attorney General, is that we will do our best to get you accurate information as quickly as we can.
Well, what I'm trying to get at, your defense of your friend Lanny Brewer, I guess at some level, is admirable. I just don't understand it. It took me a minute to get you to admit that he knew that guns were being walked, and there are scores of emails where he admitted it. He assigned a prosecutor to Fast and Furious. This is someone who on his own website boasts of being one of the best 100 lawyers in America. He knew that guns were being walked. He assigned a prosecutor to Fast and Furious. He forwarded an email to his home computer of a draft of Mr. Weich's letter. And he's going to stick around, Mr. Attorney General?
Well, you're saying things here, see, but you're doing what I asked you to not do before. That is conflating things. I said he knew about, and he admitted that he knew about gun walking when it came to Operation Wide Receipt.
Well, Mr. Holder, the letter is very specific. ATF makes every effort to interdict weapons that have been purchased illegally and prevent their transportation to Mexico. Is that true or false?
That is not accurate, but Mr. Brewer didn't, as he indicated, he said he did not have anything to do with the creation.
He forwarded this letter, a draft of it, to his home computer. Now, it does not take a long walk to get that he forwarded it to his home computer to read it.
I'm only going by what Mr. Brewer has testified to, which is that he did not think that he reviewed the letter, reviewed the drafts before they went out.
Who is Daniel Mudd?
He was the CEO of Fannie Mae during this period.
What was his total compensation?
I don't know off the top of my head, sir.
So you wouldn't disagree if it were $12 million?
That could be right.
How about Richard Siren?
He was the CEO of Freddie Mac.
During what time period?
I'm not sure, but it ended at the time of conservatorship.
Exactly, 2003 to 2008. Now, what was his total compensation for that time period?
Again, I'm sorry, sir, I don't know that.
Would you disagree with me if I told you it was more than $38 million?
I could believe that.
All right, so surely you can understand the frustration of taxpayers who are paying bonuses while the bus is driven through the gates of hell, right, and then you want us to pay bonuses while the people change the tires. Who was James Johnson?
James Johnson was the CEO of Fannie Mae prior to back in the 1990s.
And what was his total compensation during that time period?
It was substantial, sir. I don't know.
$100 million.
Right.
Now, he had a good working relationship with Congress, right?
Yes, he did.
Okay. Now, Franklin Raines, what was his total compensation?
I don't know, sir.
Would you disagree if it were more than $90 million? And he had a good working relationship with Congress. So sitting here simply saying that we need a better working relationship with Congress, one could argue that's what got us into this abyss.
I'm sorry, I don't recall saying having a better working relationship with Congress. I thought I said...
I've heard you mention the word Congress a half dozen times. And Mr. Chairman, if I could have 30 more seconds, the graveyard is full of people who are waiting on federal judgeships that never came. And I've heard the argument time and time again that we have to raise compensation levels for federal judges so we can attract the right kind of people. And yet every time there's an opening, there are 100 folks that are dying for it. They'll take a tremendous cut in pay. I find it bitterly ironic that the total compensation for the United States Supreme Court justices is less than either of these two men made. So here we are again, Mr. Speaker, less than 6 months removed from last summer's so-called debt crisis, on the verge of committing another act of generational embezzlement. We are on the verge of assigning another $1 trillion of debt to our progeny because we can't muster the courage to make hard decisions. We're on the verge of $16 trillion in debt, Mr. Speaker, because we can't bring ourselves to say no. We're on the verge of $16 trillion in debt, Mr. Speaker, because we refuse to have a serious conversation about the role of government juxtaposed with the role of the individual. And in times like this, when leadership and moral courage, as my friend from South Carolina, Mick Mulvaney, so eloquently put it, when moral courage and leadership are needed, we get slogans more befitting of a student body president race than a campaign to be the leader of the free world. This administration says it wants a balanced approach, but a balanced approach apparently doesn't include a balanced budget. This administration says it wants a grand bargain, a big transformative deal, but the details of such a deal would fit nicely on the backside of a postage stamp. And my personal favorite, Mr. Speaker, this administration wants the, quote, rich to pay their fair share. I've heard that phrase several times this morning. What I have not heard, Mr. Speaker, because they never seem to get around to defining who the rich are, and they never seem to get around to defining the word fair, which may be the most subjective word in the English language. So I would ask, is it fair? Is 34% not enough? Do you want a half? You want 2/3?
Gentleman yield for an answer?
Will your president define who the rich are?
Will the gentleman yield for an answer?
And what's fair?
I'll be happy to answer the gentleman if the gentleman will yield. Will the gentleman yield?
The gentleman from South Carolina controls the time.
I didn't hear the answer. Will the gentleman yield?
The gentleman from Colorado will suspend. The gentleman from South Carolina may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope the generations that come after us will have the courage the generations that came before us had, for we have been profiles in timidity and greed.
I think that American people should know that the members of Congress are underpaid. A lot of members can't even afford to live decently when they have their job in Washington.
So what is your thought about a pay raise for Congress? And this, if I make a lot of friends on either side of the aisle, I'm sure, with your answer, whatever it may be.
You know, Greta, I know a lot of people in the world that are underpaid. In fact, I live with one who's a school teacher. But members of Congress are incredibly blessed and fortunate to have the jobs that we have. Nobody makes us run. Every 2 years, we offer for public office, and if you don't want to do it, then don't run. But the notion that you can make $174,000 in this country and be underpaid is laughable. We are better off than 99.9% of the people that we claim to work for, and I would be embarrassed to say that given our job performance and our salary, that we are anything other than grossly overcompensated. Public service means you give something up. You get compensation in other ways. You get the benefit of working in the Capitol, of being part of history, of being able to vote for your fellow citizens, all of which is priceless. So even if we were doing a great job, which no one believes, including our families and staffs, believe we are, we still don't deserve a raise. Because there are equally important jobs like law enforcement and firefighters and education and anyone who takes care of children who make far less. My wife makes a fifth what I make. My sheriff makes less than half of what I make. And they do a great job. So $174,000 is a lot of money, Greta, whether you're doing a great job or not so great a job. And look, there are members of Congress that I think earn their salary. I think, you know, Jason Chaffetz, I'm a huge fan of his, Jimmy Jordan, Paul Ryan. There are lots of people that are in politics for exactly the right reason, but every one of them knows that you're going to give something up. If you think you can make more money in the private sector, then don't run for office. If you think you can make more money practicing law, then practice law. But don't run for office and then complain about the salary, because you know what it is when you file. and I'll say this to the witnesses, I prepared a list of questions for all three of you. But during the ranking member's opening statements I shared with him on the floor, my mind went away from the questions and I went back to South Carolina in the very same month, the very same year that the IRS was conferencing in Anaheim. We were furloughing law enforcement officers. We were furloughing teachers. Prosecutors in my own office were furloughed. Secretaries in my own office were furloughed. Those are secretaries who struggle to make ends meet under the best of circumstances. And here we're asking them to go 2 weeks without pay, and we canceled all out-of-town training. We brought our own food to our Thanksgiving and Christmas office socials. We started an anonymous fund to help our fellow employees who were struggling to make ends meet. And one night, one of my secretaries came in after hours and asked if she could borrow the money to buy her child a birthday present. And she kept apologizing for having to do it. She kept saying, "I'll pay you back. I'll pay you back." And at exactly the same time, that young government employee, single mom, was borrowing money for a child's birthday present, other government employees were staying in $3,500 a night rooms. Other government employees were spending more money on promotional materials than that young woman makes in a year. And other government employees were spending more money on audience participation tools than that young woman makes in a year. So, Mr. Inspector General, I appreciate the work that you've done. But with all due respect, this is not a training issue. This cannot be solved with another webinar. This can't be solved with just one more recommendation. If we can just get that recommendation implemented, we're just one recommendation away from people acting responsibly. Mr. Inspector General, we can adopt all the recommendations you can possibly conceive of. I'll just tell you, it strikes me, and maybe it's just me, but it strikes me as a cultural, systemic, character, moral issue. The IRS has been in existence, depending on how you want to count, either since 1862 or 1918. But in either event, they've had 100 years to figure out that while your fellow Americans are losing their jobs and their health insurance and their homes, you do not spend $4 million at a conference for which there is no accountability. You do not hire people to make meaningless speeches or artists to paint paintings of Bono. When your fellow citizens, the ones who pay your salary, are struggling, that is a character issue. Training cannot fix that. They sent more than 25 employees on a scouting trip to see whether or not the hotel was okay. That's not going to be fixed with training, Mr. Inspector General. When you got law enforcement officers being furloughed and you've had 100 years to figure out how to act appropriately, you don't need an IG report to tell you that spending $27,000 for someone to talk about how random combinations of ideas can drive radical innovations, there's not a webinar in the world that's going to fix that. So, Mr. Inspector General, in reality, it just strikes me that we just need one single recommendation. Start over. This entity has not only targeted citizens that it was supposed to serve, it's allowed itself to be used as a political tool. Not only does it have access to our financial information, it will soon have access to our health information. Those are details that we don't share with people that we do trust. And we're going to be asked to share it with people who are so disconnected as to spend this amount of money while our fellow citizens are struggling mightily in the fall of 2010. I don't think training is going to fix it. I think replacement might.
Utah. Mr. Chairman, you have an absolute right to remain silent. No inference or suggestion of guilt may be inferred from your invocation of that right to remain silent. However, if you do testify or take the stand, you will be treated like any other witness and subject to cross-examination. Mr. Chairman, the reason that that phrase is running through my mind is because I heard it for 16 years. It's being repeated in courtrooms all across this country today, but not for powerful people that work for government, just for everyday folks. Just for everyday witnesses or everyday defendants of petty crimes, not charged with violation of constitutional rights, maybe just petty larceny. But they're being told you have a right to remain silent. However, if you testify or take the stand, you will be treated like every other witness. Mr. Chairman, I counted 17 separate factual assertions by Ms. Lerner, not those 3 little sentences that my colleagues like to cite, 17 separate factual assertions. That is a lot of talking for somebody who wants to remain silent. That's a lot of talking. If you honestly believe that you can make 17 separate factual assertions and still invoke your right to remain silent, then please tell me what waiver is. Please tell me what constitutes waiver if saying 17 separate factual things does not. Mr. Chairman, she testified, I have done nothing wrong, I've broken no laws, or broken no IRS rules or regulations. That's her testimony. What I'm saying is we should have the right to cross-examine her on that testimony. Because I'd like to ask her, when you said we need a plan, who is we, and what plan are you referring to? When she said we need to be careful that it's not perceived as political, who is we, and what are you concerned about the perception of politics for? What are you fearful of, Ms. Lerner? She said, I think we really need to do a project. Again, Ms. Lerner, who is we, and what project are you referring to? That is a legitimate question. And every brother and sister at the bar on the other side of the aisle would ask that question on cross-examination if given the opportunity. Can you imagine, Mr. Chairman, can you imagine a fact pattern where somebody takes the stand and says, I didn't rob the bank, but I'm not going to answer why my fingerprints are on the demand note, and I'm not going to tell you why I'm on the surveillance footage with the gun in my hand, and I'm not going to tell you why the die pack blew up in my car. I'm just going to tell you I didn't rob the bank. That's not the way our system works. You have to answer the other side's questions. I think these questions are fair. The Tea Party's very dangerous. Dangerous to whom? Who, Ms. Lerner? Who thinks they're dangerous? You? The IRS? Dangerous in what way? We need a vehicle to get back to court. Who is we? Why do you want to get back to court? Could it, heaven forbid, be because you don't like Citizens United? Is that possibly the explanation? Mr. Chairman, she said Cincinnati should not have these cases, but then she turned around and said Cincinnati was to blame. That's an inconsistent statement. Every lawyer on that side of the aisle would ask her to explain that inconsistency. Everyone. So why can't we? If this isn't waiver, then can someone explain to me on the other side what fact pattern constitutes waiver? If you can make 17 separate factual assertions and authenticate a document and say, I have done nothing wrong, which is about as broad as any testimony can possibly get. I've done nothing wrong. I've broken no laws. I've broken no rules or regulations. I mean, honestly, what testimony could be broader than that? So necessarily, our cross-examination should be equally broad, and it would be in a courtroom. How often did you use your personal email, Ms. Lerner? That's a fair question. The Committee on Ways and Means just referred that issue to the Department of Justice. How many times did you use your personal email? When you mused about applying for a job with an organization connected with the president, were you kidding, Ms. Lerner? Or were you serious? We know you were contemplating retirement. Were you really seriously going to work? Mr. Chairman, I know my time is up. I'm just going to say this in conclusion. The same Constitution that allows her the right, if she wants to sit there and say nothing, allows these groups the right to petition their government for redress.
Judge,
well, I want to make it easier for you. How long will it take you to produce Lois Lerner's emails that don't involve 6103 material from January of 2010?
Well,
can we have that by Friday?
Absolutely not.
Why?
No way, because there's no way physically we can get
January of 2010. That's 1 month. No 6103 material, just email.
1 month.
Just 1 month. When can we get that?
We have to go through each of those emails to make sure it has no 6103.
Well, how long is that going to take? Can we have it by Friday?
I have no idea.
Just 1 month, Commissioner. January of 2010. No 6103, and let me tell you why I'm interested in it.
No, well, I'll tell you, today is Wednesday. I'd be happy to ask the people who do the work and get back to you.
All right, let's do January of 2010, and then let's get ambitious and do February of 2010, and then let's go March 2010. And I think you know why I'm doing 2010, Commissioner. When the president likes 5-4 Supreme Court decisions, he calls that settled law, like the ACA. When he doesn't like 5-4 Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United, he attacks it, which is what he did in January of 2010. And that's why the timeline is so important, Commissioner. The jury is never entitled to know the motive, but they always want to know the motive. You don't ever have to prove why somebody did something, but the jury always wants to know, why did this happen? And if you start in January 2010 with the President's State of the Union address, and then you move through Lois Lerner's emails that have nothing to do with 6103 material, you begin to see a motive develop.
Great. You're going to get 20,000 pages of documents this afternoon. Some of them may well be January 2010. But I will check with our people, because if you would like us to stop that production of Lois Lerner emails and go to January 2010, I will go and find out exactly how long.
What I want is this. I want the subpoena complied with. I want it complied with in a timely fashion. And you and I both know that if there's no 6103 material, whether or not you think we need something or we ought to have it, or that we're on a wild goose chase, frankly, I could care less what you think about that. Mr. Schulman, when you learned that conservative groups were being targeted by the IRS for discriminatory treatment, what did you do?
When I learned of the existence of a BOLO list, in that same conversation or right around that time, I also learned a couple things. One, that it was being stopped. So that.
All right, and who told you it was being stopped?
That's Steve Miller, my deputy.
All right, and did you investigate further? Can you give me the name of a single person who was involved in the original decision to target conservative groups for disparate treatment?
I'm not aware of those names.
Why can't you give me a name?
So at the same time that I learned and that it was being stopped, I was also told that the Inspector General was aware of it.
Mr. Schulman, is the Inspector General the only person who can investigate wrongdoing within the IRS?
My general practice.
Can you answer my question, and then you can explain? Is the Inspector General the only entity who can investigate wrongdoing?
Congress can investigate.
How about you? Can you do it?
The practice at the Internal Revenue Service that I inherited.
So if there's inappropriate conduct being done on your watch in the IRS, then that inappropriate conduct can last as long as the Inspector General's investigation lasts. Is that what you're telling me? That you're not going to step in and stop it?
No, what I'm telling you.
If there's someone wielding a knife in the parking lot, are you going to call the Inspector General? Are you going to wait until his or her investigation's over before you stop it?
When I was told about these allegations, I was also told that they were being stopped. and so that the inappropriate criteria were not being used
And despite
anymore.
the seriousness and potential criminality of that conduct, you didn't investigate it yourself at all?
So the procedures that I inherited and that my
Mr.
general
Shulman,
practice
this is going
was
to go
with-
much quicker if you'll answer yes or no, and then you can explain. Did you do anything to verify that the practice, as insidious as it was stopped?
The Inspector General was going to be looking into it, and that's what
Is it that you can't say yes or no, or you're just choosing not to say yes or no? Can you answer the question, did you do anything personally to make sure that this insidious, discriminatory practice was stopped? Yes or no?
At the time that I learned about it, I also learned two things. The first was that it was being stopped, and the second was that the Inspector
And what did you do to verify that it was stopped?
The responsible deputy of the Internal Revenue Service told me it was being stopped. I had no reason to believe otherwise.
Did you investigate why conservative groups were being targeted?
Excuse me?
Did you investigate? So you can't give me a single name. You can't answer the who. Can you tell me the why? Why were conservative groups? Why was the culture such under your watch that an employee felt comfortable targeting conservative groups? Did you investigate that?
You know, from my reading of the report, I can't tell if it was political motivation or if it was tone deaf, somebody trying to expedite a way to
You
get cases.
still don't know that this was political.
Excuse me?
You still don't know that this was political?
I defer to the Inspector General.
Well, I'll tell you this, Mr. Shulman. Your predecessor said that he wasn't sure if it was partisan, and that requires the listener to be as stupid as the speaker to utter a comment like that. He just testified that policy positions dictated this. What does that mean to you? If it's not partisan, what does that mean?
I'm not sure I heard that testimony.
Did you lift a finger to identify the facts?
Felt very comfortable. The facts, the Inspector General was going to run down the facts, and once he had it, it would be reported out.
Let the record reflect that's a no.